I'm going to show you the best way to approach a super smooth and satisfying morphing transition animation, all using shape layers in After Effects. We'll do that by breaking down exactly how I made this animation in extreme detail, and we'll be covering the first two of these morphs in this video. Now this is a small section from my course Master Motion Design, but you can enjoy it as a free preview. Don't worry, I'm not going to leave you on a cliffhanger in between an edit on the graph editor or anything like that. Enjoy it uninterrupted, and I'll give you some more information at the end.
Alright, in this chapter we will be animating the transition from spade to heart, and we'll be able to do that with everything we have already in our After Effects project. Now if we look back at our thumbnail, we're going to approach this by having our spade sort of, I don't say unravel, unfurl, sort of expand and open up, becoming a more rounded shape and then closing back in as a heart. But all of this is going to happen very quick. The fastest motion is going to be, these 3 frames in the middle, and then ease into the heart, and of course easing out of the spade at the very beginning. So let's get stuck in and make that. Now it looks like we have way more layers than we need for this. I do want to keep our spade full and our heart full layers as reference at the very least. But for our spade, I think all we need is the spade half. So let's delete the other layers, and let's turn down the transparency of our spade full layer as well. So we can see a faint outline, which will be our reference, and we can delete that after we're done. Same for the heart, we can delete everything except for the heart half and lower the transparency of heart full. And we're only animating half, of course, because this is completely symmetrical. So why animate it twice when we can animate it once and then flip it over? I'm going to show you some neat ways we can do that flipping over as well later, so you don't have to wait until the very final moment. And then in the middle of this action, we're going to swap over to the heart. So it'll be kind of like a match cut in the middle. We're going to do whatever we can to get these sort of 2 frames in between these 2 shapes to be as identical as possible. But why are we doing it as 2 shapes and not just the one shape path? And that is because, well, we're going to be animating their path. So let's open up the path property on both of them and just add some keyframes to start with. It might also be useful to lock the heart full and spade full references as well, so we don't accidentally click them. And we can see in our heart layer, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 vertices in this shape layer. But on our spade full, we've got a lot more. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's going to be tricky if we copy and paste the path from their heart onto our spade. And actually, I'm going to show you that very quickly. Let's copy this keyframe and let's select our spade's path and paste that into the same area. Okay, so now we've got a transition between spade and heart. But how does that look? That is not a pleasing transition or morph at all. And why is it doing that? Because After Effects doesn't know that we want it to sort of unfold and become a nice elegant in-between shape before we go to our heart. It is just taking these points, the least possible distance to arrive at this next series of points in our heart. After Effects does not care about our ideas or our plans unless we put it in the data in the keyframe so it knows what to do. And also we run into the problem here of the first vertex of our shape. And that is a common mistake people run into when morphing, especially using this technique where it's all on the shape path. And I will show you that in a new layer. Now, just with a pencil, I am going to draw a rough square shape. And you can see as I'm drawing on each vertex, there is a box, a square. But on the first one we drew, there is 2 squares. And that means that that is the first vertex. And the first vertex is how After Effects decides what order these vertexes should be in at the next transition. So let me show you by keyframing this path here, and then a few seconds later, we rotate this 90 degrees and push it over a bit. So now our box rotates because this first vertex is on the top left here, and on the right, it is on the top right. So every other vertex just follows the path of least resistance. And this one in the bottom right corner moves barely anything at all because it is so close to its final position. But we can change the first vertex, and we can do that by selecting another point and then right-clicking and going to Mask and Shape Path and Set First Vertex. So now this bottom right point is the first vertex, but on our first keyframe, it's still in the top left. So now this is going to change our animation. It's not going to rotate 90 degrees to the right. It is going to shrink down and flip back over because each of these points are trying to get to another place on the square. Our top right is going to the bottom left. Our bottom right is going to the top left, and our bottom left is going to the top right. So we get this very unpleasant sort of shrinking down and expanding. And you can see how that gets a bit more complicated to deal with when you have more and more complex paths like in our spade and in our heart. So that is one method to troubleshoot your morph. If it is not happening how you would expect, check where your first vertex is, and that might be the culprit. Okay, let's get rid of this shape layer. Let's get rid of this heart keyframe on our spade and get into animating. So let's set this first keyframe on our spade at the very start of this 1 second. And we're leaving 1 second available before our workspace, just because this comp is going to loop. And when we have looping elements, when we want our last position to sync up with our first position, it's going to be pretty convenient to be able to move this over to the start and match things up there outside of this work area, so it just loops seamlessly. But we'll get more to that at the very end of this lesson. And let's look at our thumbnail for what rough shape we want this in-between shape to be. I think something along these lines, maybe not so circular, but a sort of more rounded blobby heart shape. So let's move these points around to create something roughly that shape. With the points at the very center, I am going to hold shift and drag to make sure they don't cross into either too far to the left or right. We want that definitely to keep in the exact center for when we flip it. And let's move these other points outwards. Oh, we can see we've got way too many points here. We don't need that many points. More points are going to get in our way. So the easiest thing to do is to just delete these with our pen tool. Go to the delete vertex tool. That might mess up our first keyframe. And it does. But luckily enough, we have our guide layer here, so we can go in and adjust that. I'll grab the convert vertex tool and just draw some handles on this vertex and get them to line up as nicely as I can. There. Now let's transform this second shape into that blob, making sure we've got our pen tool back selected again. Let's have this point come down because that will become this rough heart shape, but we don't want it pointing inwards yet. Let's have it sort of pointing outwards. And then move these around to make our shape a bit rounder. All right, that is looking pretty good. Let's move this keyframe to the very end of that layer. And let's extend it out a frame so we can see it underneath our heart. And then let's open up our heart half property. We can move this keyframe to the very right. And at the very start, at 1 second where this heart begins, we're just going to move these vertices and line them up to this shape. And again, we have too many points. This area here, this must be from an Illustrator where we joined our circle to the bottom of the heart and it's created too many vertexes. Okay, let's get rid of that keyframe. Go to our finished heart keyframe. Let's drag these points out and get rid of a couple of them and get rid of 2 of them and then redraw it so it lines up with our guide. There, okay. And this is a very common issue, so you might run into this with a lot of your shape. So I thought I might leave this in, show you another way to troubleshoot editing your shape layers. Because animating on shape path is something I love to do, but I'm not going to say there isn't a lot of difficulties and troubleshooting and things that might not go to plan on your first attempt. Okay, back to the middle to our transition keyframes. Now we can drag these out and match this shape. Okay, that's not looking great just yet. Let's do a few things to make that a little easier on the eyes straight away. First, let's reduce our work area. So it's just going between these 2 shapes. And we could probably hide these guide layers as well because we don't really need those. And also another thing I'm going to do is add a fill effect to this side of the heart. And I'm going to eyedrop our dark blue color. So they appear to be the same. And that's just so we don't get that jarring split of the colors when this transition happens. Now, after we've done this transition, I'm going to turn off this fill effect to get it back to the red because once the transition looks seamless, it changing color won't be noticeable at all. But at the moment it takes away and is distracting from our actual purpose, which is getting the animation smooth. So again, I like to just reduce the amount of elements that we don't need on screen for this to happen. And this is a pretty simple composition where we've just got 2 layers. If the background was really busy, I might hide the background or I just might solo both of these layers. Do anything you can to remove the clutter of the scene and just focus on your task at hand. And also I use the fill effect rather than changing the fill up here, just because it is 1 less click to get to the eyedropper. That's all. Nothing too fancy about it. You can change the color however you want. Okay, now let's add some easing because that is going to really help a lot. So let's select both end keyframes, press F9 to easy ease them, and that's probably going to look a whole lot better. Yeah. Even just doing that makes it look much better. Now let's increase the easing on these keyframes. And we can do that in the speed graph editor because of course in a shape path, there is no value. It is just a path shape. So let's create as much easing as possible, drag out this handle to the right and then drag this handle to the right as well to make it as pointy as possible. Excellent. Let's do that on our heart half as well. Great. How does that go? That is excellent. One thing I am noticing is that it is far too slow, even with all of that easing. This goes for a second. I think about half a second is probably where we want. So let's go to 12 frames in, and let's trim this layer to finish at 12 frames and our heart to start. And we can extend our heart layer because the heart layer will need to stick around for its next transition anyway. And move this end keyframe to 2 seconds. So now the animation takes place over 1 second. All right, that is looking good. That's looking much better. Now there's still a fair bit we can do to refine this and make this look much smoother and elegant. But now I think is a good time to duplicate this layer and flip it. Now there are, of course, a bunch of ways we can do this. We can simply duplicate this half of our layer, go up to layer, transform, flip horizontal, move that over to the left, line it up in the middle, and then we have it perfectly symmetrical. And what flipping it horizontally essentially does is really just alter the scale. So if we look at our scale on this property, the scale width is minus 100%. So that is just being flipped and then locked again. So another way you could do this is, unlike this property, adjust the scale width and then lock it again. Now this does have the disadvantage because now we have 2 keyframes with identical properties. So when we edit our right side, we're going to have to edit our left side, but we can avoid that. And that is just by linking these with expressions. So let's rename these first. Let's call this spade half left and spade half right. Let's also unlock this spade full and shrink that down because that is getting in the way in our timeline. Okay, back to duplicating the path animation. So with spade left, we can just delete these keyframes. And at the moment it has no keyframes, no animation. But if we Alt or Option click on the stopwatch, that brings up our expression window and we can grab our pick whip and drag that onto our spade half right path. And when we release it on there, we'll take all the details from these keyframes and put them in this layer. And because it is that scale property that's causing the flip to happen, it maintains its symmetry in being flipped. We don't just have 2 duplicate right side shapes. Now there is another technique we can do to flip it, and I'll show that on our heart. And that is by using the effect mirror. And with the mirror effect, we can drag the reflection center or just place that in the very middle of our comp and adjust the reflection angle to 180. And again, we have our layer perfectly mirrored. There is a slight gap in the middle just because of where we've placed our center, but we can adjust that. And this is a fine technique as well. The only issue with this, say if this was a pre-comped element and we needed to scale up what was inside or rotate it or make adjustments to it, the center and the angle do come off at a certain point. So I much prefer the first method that we showed using the duplicate shape layers. So I'll do that for our heart. That's just a little more secure, a little more sturdy and safe. Okay, now we've got our shape symmetrical and it's looking pretty close. Let's go add some more nuanced detail to make this looking as good as possible. So one thing I'm noticing is our middle sort of shape is probably bulging out a bit too much. It is much wider than both our spade and our heart. So maybe let's push it in a little bit and adjust the other points to still make it look smooth. And we can see that updating real time on our left half as well, which is handy. And I think we barely want it to be wider than our initial shapes at all. There. And now when we go to edit our first half of the animation, our spade right half, we'll notice the keyframe is in the exact same position as our heart. And we can't really edit it at this position because we can't see it. And really, what's the point of having this keyframe here if it's not going to be visible? Besides being useful to trace over for our first half here. But really, there's no point to these shapes being exactly identical in the middle. So let's move it over 1 frame to the left. And here, let's make some of the same adjustments. Let's get it much skinnier. And there, I think that matches it a bit better. The motion isn't going outwards so more, it's more going downwards and sort of breathing. So it expands at the bottom and then rises more to the top. And I think we can play with that a little bit more. At the moment, if we follow that across both shapes, it starts, well, hypothetically at the top of this spade here. Really, we're just following what this point, the apex of both of our shapes is doing. So it essentially just falls and then continues falling. So it's just making one downwards motion throughout the whole transition. But what if it went down a little bit further? So what if we move these top points a little bit lower? Same with our spade half. There, I think that's a little more interesting. So instead of moving a pretty linear path from the top to the bottom, it moves down. And when it gets to this point, it's almost as if it has a little impact here, like it hits the ground like a rock falling. And then that sort of warps the environment. Like, let's say you were to drop, a rock on a plate of jelly. Where the rock enters, it would sort of pierce and go down into the jelly and the outside edges would sort of roll up. Same with water. And it just makes it feel like the other parts of this shape are reacting to its motion. Of course, let's go into this frame and round out these edges so it looks prettier. There, that is looking good. And the main other thing I'm not liking is the negative space in this shape here. These pointy elements that make up the sort of top of the stem in the spade. And I don't really like that they create sort of pretty unattractive shapes around this point here. And it really just looks like this nice sort of curved moon shape is just being crushed into this flat shape, which, you know, really it is. But what would be nicer if this shape was to just move outwards and get skinnier as a sort of crescent moon shape. Now that might be a little hard to explain, so I'm going to have to show it. So in this last frame here, before we become our heart layer, we have those vertexes that make up that crescent moon shape, and they're all flat against the wall. Well, they're all making up the rounded edge of the heart, and they don't need to, because that gives a pretty harsh transition between the frame before it, where there's still this sort of crescent moon, looking more like a shark fin, and then we've got essentially 2 frames of it being this rounded shape at its most extreme state, one on our heart and one on our spade. So it might look nicer if we create that crescent moon shape that we want here, and we can make it as thin as we like. So let's move this vertex inwards, and then we can move our anchor points like this even. And we can move our anchor points. We can flip this one over. Now this shape to me is just a little more elegant than the shape we had before when these 3 vertexes were all just mashed to the side here, raising to be as close to the edge as possible. But now if we play it back, that crescent closes up a little more organically, I think. And let's see how that looks in context. There, I think that is looking great. Now the only thing we have to do is remove the fill effect from our heart. Oh, from both sides of our heart, actually. And let's see how that plays. That's looking much better. And now that color change isn't nearly as distracting because these shapes flow so nicely into one another. Now this in-between shape that we've created, I call it a rounded heart, but it kind of looks more like a bean here. You can use any shape that you want for this. This in-between shape between these 2 states could be anything. It could be really long and skinny. It could be really pointy. And that is going to change significantly the flavor of this animation. As long as the start and the end point are the same, you're going to go from a spade to a heart. But we've got 1 full second of motion here where we've got all these in-between shapes. So deciding what this middle shape should be is pretty important because that's going to be the majority of the animation. And I think, like I said before, change a bit of the flavor or change the mood of how this animation feels. One thing I do think you should keep in mind is repeating shapes and curves that are in the final and original positions. Now the design of these suits are fairly sort of geometric and pointy. We've got a lot of curves. There's not many right angles. I think the only right angle is in our diamond. Actually, no right angles in there, but I think the only straight lines. So I wouldn't have a middle position that is, a perfect square, because straight lines and corners just don't appear in these shapes, in these designs. So keeping that visual language consistent, even between shapes like this, even in the middle, when it's moving so fast, will really help your animation feel like it suits the design, because not all animation will suit the design. If you have pretty elegantly designed suits like these with lots of curves and lots of points, and then you have this blocky, chunky animation where it just clunks around the screen, that's not going to look appropriate and suit this animation. But if you were animating boxes moving around a scene, some nice clunky, linear, straight animation would look great. So just another thing to be aware of, and that is why I spent that extra time refining this shape here, that I even want to spend even more time getting it a little nicer. Even though you don't really see this. When you watch the animation, you barely see that frame, but you can definitely feel it, especially when you're working with such few keyframes like we are here. That is going to impact not just this frame, but all these frames in between it. But there we are, that is our first transition. Next, we are going to change this heart into our clubs. Now, like our transition between the spade and the heart, there will be a little in-between state, a transitional period with some separate elements. And that will be when it splits into these 3 circles, which are of course separated on their own layer. And part of the reason you might want to do this is to make the transition a little easier. So let's just bring these 3 circles out and trim them here. Trim our heart to their start again. Okay, so now we go from the heart to these 3 circles to the clubs. And the heart to these 3 circles is looking a little bit easier now. We don't have to deal with this stem at the bottom, and we can see that our heart is made up of really 2 circles at the top and then this sort of pointy shape at the bottom. So if we were to rotate the heart, we would end up with 2 circles on the bottom and a point at the top. And the rotation is just one of several ways that you could get between these 2 objects. And we are going to use the rotation as the sort of lead motion in this section, because this one will have far more moving elements than our first morph. So breaking it down into have a little hierarchy of the motion will be helpful. So we'll animate the rotation first, make sure that is feeling good, and then we're going to add our extra bits on top of that. So let's get all of our layers in the right order. Our heart full, I don't think we need that layer anymore, because we've got our full heart. Let's trim down our heart sections. I don't think they need to go that far. And then we're going to have the circles for our clubs. And then the stem and the middle aren't going to come on until later. And then we have our clubs full as well. And we can push that towards the back of our timeline and maybe hide that as well. So let's start with that rotation movement. And because we have got so many elements that we all really want to really stay connected as one main piece, we're going to animate the rotation on a new null. So let's press Ctrl Alt Shift Y to create a new null, and I'll call it null club rotate for now. That seems like an adequate description. And at the moment, this is in the very center of our comp, but I think we need to push it to the center of our clubs, which will be slightly different. And that looks pretty accurate. So from there, let's parent everything to that null, our heart and our club components. So now this null controls everything. Now for the rotation. Now this is the point where our rotation will be finished because that's when all of our club components now come back in. We've got all the circles and the stem and this middle part as well. So let's keyframe its rotation here. And then a little earlier, we want to rotate it minus 180 degrees. And actually that will make a problem for our heart, which is now flipped. Let's undo that rotation and unparent the heart. The heart does not need to be parented to that null just yet. Okay, let's go to minus 180 degrees on that rotation. And there we go. And we can see that's already looking a lot closer to our heart here. The main difference between these circles and the heart is that they're red. So one thing we'll need to do is adjust the color of them. And again, we can use the fill effect. Let's eyedrop that specific red. There we are. And I am going to apply that to all of these circles, but I'm not just going to copy and paste them. I'm going to use a special copy. I'm going to edit and selecting copy with relative property links. So what this will do is copy this effect, but when I paste it, it actually has expressions inside here. So if we open up the effect and toggle down to the color, you can see that this color is now linked to the fill effect applied to this layer. So if we change the color of this layer with the fill effect, it changes the color on all the others. And that'll just make it slightly handier when we go to change the color. A very useful technique, the copy with property links and relative property links. And the difference between property link and relative property links is copy with property links will link those effects to this exact effect here. Whereas if I copy with relative property links, it will copy them relative to what this layer is in that pre-comp. Say if we were to make a duplicate of this comp and we didn't choose relative property links, all of these circles in that other comp would still be linked to this one layer in this comp, not to the layer in their own comp. So I tend to use relative property links because I work more often with a lot of duplicate comps to try things out and test things, and don't want to end up with an unused comp somewhere that's controlling colors of some layers in some other comps. If I can help it, I like to avoid that. So now this is looking really close. And even as we scrub through the timeline, we can see our clubs getting attached and it's looking a lot more like clubs. So now it's looking a bit more easy to deal with. So first let's easy ease these keyframes. We'll do that with F9 and we'll jump into the graph editor. And I think we should make this pretty snappy. Let's have a lot of easing in this. So we want a fair bit of easing in here so it gets up to quite a fast speed in the middle, which is where we can hide some of these other objects revealing on, like our stem and the middle of our club. That's looking good. Great. Now let's work on our heart and its transition into these three circles. Now this is similar to a match cut, or like the motion we did here before. We need to have a little bit of motion, a little bit of anticipation before this cut to these three shapes to make the transition look believable. Now our heart is splitting in pieces. So I'm thinking a motion that looks like it's tearing away and moving outwards. I don't mean that to sound as violent as it does, but I think it will look great if we have a bit of anticipation in our heart, maybe sort of shrinking, going inwards, contracting, and then sort of bursting out. And that bursting out point will be into these circles. So these circles will change in their position and just move outwards slightly. Now let's create some anticipation at the end of this layer. So where this last keyframe is oh, that almost lines up to 2 seconds. Let's move it to 2 seconds. Let's animate its scale property. So we want the whole heart to shrink down very slightly. Let's move the anchor point to the very center of the heart. We just grab with the move anchor point tool. And then let's parent the left half of the heart, which should be labeled. Let's label that right now. Okay, so they're both parented to this heart and the anchor point's in the middle. So let's animate the scale. And we need it to shrink a little bit, but not too much, maybe 90%. That might seem like a lot. Actually, that's not too bad, 90%. And we want to easy ease this keyframe because this motion is going to be the fastest. So we can leave that like this. And then we can increase that easing going into our graph editor. That looks good. And maybe it's not that slow. Maybe that's a bit faster. There, now for the position of our circles. Let's open up P on our keyboard. Let's keyframe them all at the very start. And we want to make sure by this point, they all need to be back in the same position. So let's keyframe them again at the end. And then a few frames after this animation, they need to be out wide. And I'm going to line up with this keyframe just because it seems a little neater to keep your project file like this rather than putting the keyframe here. It won't matter too much. This is a bit of a, finicky thing. And consideration I like to have is where possible, keep my animation looking as tidy as possible, but want your project to be as neat as possible, but not so much that it compromises your animation. Okay, so around here, we need our circles bursting outwards from the center. Now I'm just going to eyeball this by clicking and dragging, moving its position further out from the center. And I'll do that with all of the circles. And I'm just trying to make these lines in the motion path the same length for all of these. And that should be close enough. And if you can't see the motion path, if you go to Edit Preferences and Display, you might have no motion path selected. So if you can't see any of this stuff, that's why. Or you might not have your toggle mask and shape path visibility on. Okay, so now they're moving out. Let's see how that plays in animation. Oh, okay, that's not looking too bad. This little section with that small anticipation of the heart scaling down and then expanding with the circles looks good, even before our easing. And they weren't even lined up with this keyframe, so now you know how it really doesn't matter. And actually, let's move these further across. Now I'm noticing they're a bit too far out where our club middle. Let's move them a bit further back, maybe a bit too far. And now we need to add easing to these keyframes. I'm going to go into this first one. Let's do this in the speed graph. Just maximize the ease at the very start. And then we can copy the easing with ease copy. Let's copy these and paste them to our other layers. Oh, and that looks great. This separation between the heart into the pieces, I think is looking really good. And then we've got them coming back after the club rotates, and that's not quite as smooth. One thing that I do notice is this middle part here. That needs to come on once all of these circles touch. Because once they touch, we don't really have any edges to deal with. It's a nice enclosed space that we can fill in. Now we really want this middle piece and this stem to pop on in the middle of this rotation, where it's going the fastest, where it will be easiest tied. So the middle of the rotation is, looks like this frame here. So this frame here, we need our circles to be back in the middle. So what we can do is copy and paste these keyframes from the back resting position. And then maybe push them in a little further as well, a bit more towards the center. Not too far, because I think a bit of extra motion might be helpful for two reasons. One reason is that the gap that we'll need to fill in is much smaller with our club middle piece, really barely a gap at all. So when they come together, this is pretty much filled up. I'm going to nudge it just a few more pixels each circle to actually fill it up. Then our club middle turns on. And then we get a bit more motion as these circles sort of pull out. And we finish that rotation. Now, how does that look? Okay, that's looking much better. Let's improve the easing on all of these because our circles don't even ease out to these positions yet. And maybe these keyframes we move a bit forward as well. Okay, let's go into our graph editor. And add some easing like this. And remember, we're only applying this easing to one circle as well. So we kind of have to make our brain only look at this one circle that starts at the top left and ends in the bottom right. Well, I think that's looking pretty good. Let's go and copy and paste that easing onto our other layers. Okay, I think that's looking good. Our club middle probably needs to pop on a little bit later. Maybe we move these keyframes back a little more. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to do some sound effects now. We have a heart going, and then we get a whoosh, and then it comes to a rest. So there's sort of two motions in this transition. We get a 1, 2. Excellent. Okay, now let's finish up how our club resolves in. So we need to resolve on this little stem. Now I think this should just fold out of the ether. So we're going to do that with scale. Let's unlink our scale properties, keyframe it here, which will be its final position. And then in the middle, in the big heat of battle, in the middle of this rotation, we want it to appear on. So let's keyframe this at 0. So it will unfold and we can copy and paste the easing from our other layers. And that's looking pretty good. Now, one thing you might want to think about is, do we need this to be at 0 pixels, at 0% scale? Because if we're at 0% scale, it's invisible. So we have one frame of nothing happening here. And we've trimmed this layer here anyway, so it's not going to be visible beforehand. So if you do want it to be a bit more of a gradual scale up, you might put this at 10%. So now we have a frame of it being very, very thin that we didn't have before. And the rest of our easing will pretty much be the same, but it might just look a little bit smoother because now we have one more frame of this being visible in the transition. And I think that's looking pretty good. And now the color of our circles. And we can change that with this fill effect. So we can just animate this color property by clicking the stopwatch, which will bring it up down here. And then when we get to the very middle of the frame where all our stuff pops in, we can grab the eyedropper tool and eyedrop the other colors. Excellent. Now this does leave a transition of colors, which you might like, which will be, smoother. For the red going to the blue, we go through this sort of dark purple color. But I really want these to be whole frames. Nowhere else in the design is there any gradients. It's only the 3 colors, the background, the blue, or the black, and the red. And apologies if I refer to this color as both black and blue. It's a very dark blue, but it's pretty much black. Okay, so I don't want there to be any sort of gradients in between, so I'm going to turn these into hold frames by pressing Control and Alt and clicking on them. And then I might move this first one to the start, not that it makes any difference, but it just gets out of the way. So these are red until it hits this keyframe, and they all turn blue. And when I do play that back, there is this little flash of this white triangle in the middle here. And even though that would appear if this motion was natural, it catches our eye. And if it catches our eye and looks out of place, it shouldn't be there. Or if it looks better by removing it, why not do that? So let's just grab our club middle layer. And if we move that forward, well, we've got the other color. Maybe if we split this layer with Control-Shift-D, and then on this first frame, we fill it in the red color. We've created an extra layer, but let's see if it works. Okay, I think that's looking a little better. Now somehow our stem has gotten off center. I don't know what happened here. It probably wasn't noticeable when our circles were red, but oh, okay, it looks like its rotation has moved 1 degree. Let's turn that back to 0. Okay, dead center. Don't know how that rotation happened, but these things do. Okay, our transition is looking pretty smooth and almost complete. Now, one thing I do want to do is just add a bit more of anticipation with this heart here. And because we've already got the heart path keyframed, it's already open in our timeline, what better place to do it than that? And we're just going to move this shape of the heart slightly more towards these circles. And I think the best place to do that is just at the bottom here. So if we select our pen tool, now if we select that layer, select the path, I know it's very hard to see because my vertices and handles are red against a red layer, but we can drag this handle, I reckon, out a little bit to make it just a bit rounder at the bottom and maybe scooch it upwards a little bit. Let's see how that looks. Now that looks pretty good, and we just get a few tiny frames before this motion happens, but it just makes it feel like it's all the one object, even though it isn't just one object. This heart is 2 objects, and then a club is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers. But because all the motion is considered, the main motion is happening on this large null, and everything is timed so that these additions of new layers happen during the fastest motion, it looks convincing. Now you might want to remove or change the easing on this keyframe. Maybe let's just move it 1 frame to the right. There we go, so it's just a little bit less rounded. We've hidden that final, more rounded keyframe, which I think works okay. And let's add a bit more flavor to the motion on this null object. Just a bit more motion to the whole sort of scene, which is, just this object or these 2 objects. That'll help reinforce these moments of change of the transition. And I like to do that mainly with position. So let's open up position. Of course, we want to separate dimensions because we only want to work with the Y position for this one. And what kind of motion do we want in here? Actually, when this first transition happens, we've got a bit of a downward motion. We can see our spade moves downwards and then our heart kind of moves upwards. What if we start at this position here, and then maybe our heart gets a little bit higher, closer to the top of the comp? Oh, we haven't parented to our null. Okay, let's go back and parent this back to our null like we did before, preemptively earlier. And let's move its height up a little. So at the start, it sort of moves upwards slightly. And then I think it should dip during this motion. So it goes down a little bit. So it goes up. And that dip kind of happens at the same time and same pace that the anticipation of the heart sort of moving and swelling is happening. And then this next keyframe was the start and end position. Let's move this to the end. And then after it dips here, let's copy and paste that keyframe a little later. So maybe stays low. And then as it spins, maybe it dips down again. So it goes dip. And then dip as it spins. And then comes up to its resting position where it all started. Okay, let's move these keyframes around. Now I think when we add some easing, these will look okay. Well, first of all, we can copy and paste the rotation easings from here. So let's copy and paste the easing of these two positions, paste them there. So at least they ease into their final position correctly. Now we can go in to the graph editor and add some easy keys to all of them. Let's see how this looks. Make sure we are in the value graph editor, of course. And let's start from the beginning. We want this first motion to be pretty sharp. So most of that motion happens during this fastest point of this transition here. Again, the moment of change being very fast. So we want fast motion. We want vertical, nice vertical handles during this point. And then at this point, the sort of peak of this sort of breath that the heart takes, it goes, we want to ease out of that. At this very drop here, we want to ease in. So again, we want nice vertical handles. And then we want to ease out of that position. And for this dip, we should ease into that as well. So that's nice and rounded. What does that look like if we go much, much lower? Let's go even lower, I think. There, I like that. I like that as these circles sort of dip down, it's sort of like they're collecting one another. So we have two motions. We have the rotation and the position that both indicate, something is happening to these objects. They're both moving down and rotating. And then as the rotation gets fast, it kind of whips it back up into the air, back into its sort of main position. And then I think we've got our second morph done. 2 morphs down, halfway to go, and I think it's looking pretty smooth.
And if you found this section of the course useful, this is just one section. This is 2 chapters out of a 7-chapter lesson, and there are 9 lessons in this course. This is from Master Motion Design, which is my intermediate course. Motion Foundation is for those not yet confident in After Effects and want a solid foundation of skills. Master Motion Design is for if you know what you're doing in After Effects, but you don't quite know how to take your motion to that next level. I cover in depth a lot of broader techniques to make sure an animation is working and give it structure that communicates your message effectively, and a lot of the subtler details that elevate that final product to look smooth and polished to a high level. More information is on my website at benmarriott.com, and you can see just some of the amazing student work to come out of the course in this student collab project.